Great. So, hi there, folks. Welcome back to another week of Who's Who. As I think I mentioned last week, we are going to be looking today at the list of our Rabbi Meir connected folks from the Talmud. This last week we looked at Elisha ben Abuya, who was Rabbi Meir's teacher and the well-known apostate. And this week we're going to be looking at Rabbi Meir's wife, Beruriah. Who has a remarkably difficult to pronounce name, but it's Beruriah. So who's Beruriah? She lived during the fourth generation of Tanaim, which makes sense because that's also when Rabbi Meir was alive. She's the daughter of Hananiah ben Tradion, who you may recall is one of the sort of famous martyrs to the Roman persecution after the defeat of the Bar Kokhba rebellion. She was the wife of Rabbi Meir, as I mentioned. So why are we talking about Beruriah tonight? So Beruriah is noteworthy for a number of things, most particularly for being the only woman in the Talmud who engaged in halachic debates with the sages on an equal level. There are other cases in the Talmud of women who engage with the rabbi in some sort of a debating sort of mode. But those are a different kind of situation. There are numerous stories in which a wealthy woman, pretty clearly a wealthy Roman woman, right, a Roman woman of some wealth and status, will engage with some rabbi to challenge them on some aspect of Judaism. And in all of those stories, like the sort of point of it is that the rabbi in question gives the woman some kind of rhetorical comeuppance, right? Some kind of sagacious rebuke. And that's kind of a genre of stories that appears in the Talmud from time to time. Beruriah isn't that person, right? One, because she is a Jewish woman and not like a foreign woman. And two, because she engages with the rabbis not as some sort of threatening outsider, but rather as one of them. The rabbis seem to interact with her more or less on their level. So regarding this phenomenon that we see in Beruriah of the Jewishly educated Jewish woman in the Talmud, right? And this sort of uniqueness of that. I want to start by drawing your attention to a pretty well-known passage this is from the Talmud, from Masechet Sota. And as usual, I'm going to share screen here to share. This is not about Beruriah, but I think it's going to be significant for our thinking about Beruriah. So this is from Mishnah Sota. Sota is the Masechet, the section of the Mishnah which deals with the curious ritual that is prescribed by the Torah in cases where a man suspects that his wife may have committed adultery, but he doesn't have proof. So this ritual involves taking the suspected wife to the temple and basically enacting a kind of magic spell, right? That binds her to tell the truth concerning her, to tell the truth concerning whether she committed adultery or not. And if she doesn't tell the truth, if she actually did commit adultery, then a curse comes upon her, which afflicts her body. And the way the rabbis read this, at least, that she dies, right? So concerning this ritual, right, this curious magical ritual that we find in the Bible, one of the things that they say in Mishnah Sota is as follows. If she, i.e. the woman who is suspected of adultery, has merit, then it delays punishment for her, and she does not die immediately. There is a kind of merit that delays punishment for 1 year, and there's a kind of merit that delays punishment for 2 years, and there's a kind of merit that delays punishment for 3 years. From here, in other words, based on this, Ben Azai states, a person is obligated to teach his daughter Torah so that if she drinks the potion and does not die immediately, she will know that some merit of hers has delayed the punishment for her. Rabbi Eliezer says, anyone who teaches his daughter Torah is teaching her tiflut, sexual promiscuity. Rabbi Yehoshua says, a woman desires to receive a kav of food. A kav is is a unit of measure. A kav of food and promiscuity, rather than to receive 9 kav of food and abstinence. He used to say, a foolish man of piety and a clever wicked person and an abstinent woman and those who injure themselves out of false abstinence, all of these are people who erode the world. So there's a lot going on in here, right? It's one of the only places in rabbinic literature where the idea of teaching Torah to women is really even raised as a possibility. And it's also a passage that is fairly redolent, right, with a certain brand of rabbinic misogyny, right? We've got this idea that maybe we should teach women Torah so that if they happen to be in this situation and they know they've committed adultery, but then the punishment doesn't come to them, then they understand that it's only their merit from studying Torah, which their merit, which is suspended the punishment for them. That it's not like the curse doesn't work, right? Rabbi Eliezer, right, possibly following along from that same logic, says, well, wait a minute. Anyone who teaches his daughter Torah is teaching her promiscuity. In other words, you're giving her the merit that accrues from studying Torah, and that's going to allow her to engage in promiscuous sex because it's going to suspend the punishment for her. And then we've got this really interesting thing from Rabbi Yehoshua, right, who seems to believe that women are very, very interested in sexual promiscuity, such that they're willing to forego food in order to get some sex, right? But then also has this interesting teaching, which suggests that an abstinent woman, a woman who does abstain from sex, is among this group of people who erode the world, right? So make up your mind, Rabbi Yehoshua. Do you want women to be abstinent from sex, or do you not want women to be abstinent from sex? There's a clear double standard here, okay? Maybe not surprising. Maybe the women in our class here can relate to the experience of encountering a weird double standard when it comes to women's relationship to sex. I don't know. So I'm going to stop sharing there. So here's the thing. Based on this text and on countless passages elsewhere in the Talmud and in rabbinic literature, depicting women as these passages which depict women as lightheaded, as ignorant, as prone to sexual promiscuity, as prone to witchcraft, the general tendency in Judaism up until modern times, and I'm talking fairly recently in Jewish history, the general tendency was, with very few exceptions, to both exclude women from Jewish education and to significantly limit social contact between men and women a lot of the time, right? Beruriah was an exception to all of that. She is depicted as engaging in halachic debate with the rabbis. That meant she had to be hanging out with the rabbis, right, in male social spaces. And it also meant that she had to be extremely well educated when it came to the rabbinic Torah, right? So here's what I want to say before we dive a little further into the details regarding Beruriah and her life. And it's this. While it is certainly worthwhile and I think useful to claim her as a positive role model for contemporary Jewish feminism, we should also take a moment and consider this. Misogynistic societies always have exceptions. They always have women who are not like other girls. They always have women who are one of the guys, right? There's always going to be those women. even maybe especially in a misogynistic society. And often this favored status comes at the cost of connection with one's fellow women. And often this status is held only on the condition that these favored women not challenge the rule, the general rule regarding female exclusion. This is a phenomenon that seems to apply actually to a lot of persecuted or low status minorities in various societies. And it's interesting to note in this regard that Beruriah's eventual sad ending is very much connected to a rare effort on her part to stand up for the honor of her sex. So we'll get to that in a little bit. But this is just sort of a set of issues that I want to kind of float as we go in here, because Beruriah is a very interesting figure in rabbinic discourse because of the degree of equality that she enjoys with the rabbis of her day. And also she is very much for the rabbis an exception that proves the rule, not a basis for challenging the rule. So with all that said, let's take a look at what the tradition actually has to tell us about the life of Beruriah, who by any standard seems to have been a remarkably wise, intelligent, educated person. So as I mentioned before, Beruriah is noteworthy for having taken part in the halachic debates that took place between the rabbis. We should probably start by kind of pointing out the degree of education that's required in order to engage in that kind of debate on that kind of level, right? So with regard to that issue of education specifically, I want to share a passage here that talks about the erudition of Beruriah, the degree to which she was a master of rabbinic learning. So I'm going to share the screen back once more. I'm going to scroll down here to the passage from, this is from the Talmud from Masechet Pesachim, about the Pesach offering, 62b, the one about where it mentions Rabbi Simlai. They're talking about the book of genealogies and how complicated and difficult it is to learn that. Can I get someone to volunteer verbally? I can't really see everybody, but verbally to read for us here.
I'll read. It's Mickey.
Thanks, Mickey.
Rabbi Simlai said to him, "Teach me the book of genealogies in 3 months." Rabbi Yochanan took a clod of dirt, threw it at him, and said to him, "Beruriah, wife of Rabbi Meir and daughter of Rabbi Hananiah ben Teradion, learned 300 halachot in 1 day from 300 sages, and nonetheless, she did not fulfill her responsibility to properly learn the book of genealogy in 3 years, because it is especially long and difficult. And you say that I should teach it to you in 3 months?"
Awesome. Nice reading. All right. So it's pretty clear what's going on here, but I want to just open it up. Any responses to this, or like what do you think is going on here? What's the point that they're trying to make?
I think it's really two-sided.
Mhm.
On the surface, it looks like he's just comparing her to a woman who did a remarkable thing, learning 300 halachot in 1 day from 300 sages, and she still couldn't do this. But on the other side, he's saying, a woman who is remarkable couldn't do it, and you're a man, and you expect me to do it. You know, expect me to teach it to you in 3 months.
Yeah, I think there may be both of those things happening here. Absolutely. But yeah, there's a very it's interesting in this regard that Beruriah's mastery of halachot, right, her learning, is being held up as you know as an example of a standard, right, for a male rabbi to not measure up to, right? I think this is pretty indicative of, the degree of, general degree of respect that the rabbis in general had for her. It's also, I think, noteworthy just for like giving us some concrete like context of, of her actual learning, right? So according to Rabbi Yochanan, at least, Beruriah learned 300 halachot in one day from 300 sages. In other words, she was able in one day to master that degree of rabbinic learning. This is a tremendous amount of learning. I certainly can't imagine learning 300 halachot in a day and having them in any kind of like order or degree of like retention in my memory. So yeah, we're clearly talking about someone, even if we're speaking hyperbolically, we're talking about someone with, like, to say the least, a thorough command of the rabbinic learning that the rabbis value so highly. Any other thoughts about this one before we move on? Okay, so here's the thing. Beruriah was clearly very well educated rabbinically. Somehow, right? It's not necessarily clear why this exception was made for her. The early rabbinic community was a lot more heterodox in certain respects than we think of traditional Judaism being today. Different rabbis made different decisions, and apparently Hanania ben Tradion felt like Beruriah could handle it, right? And so for whatever reason, she was allowed, maybe encouraged, to engage in this rabbinic learning. We also know that she used to actually engage in rabbinic discourse with the other rabbis. Because what I'm going to maybe assert here is that, at least in a de facto sort of way, the rabbis, to some extent, acknowledge her as an equal. I say this because not only did she know the Torah, not only did she engage in halachic debate, but on at least a couple of occasions, she seems to have been seriously enough regarded to have even prevailed against her rabbinic interlocutors. So we can for evidence of that, we can take a look here to one example that we can find. This is from Tosefta Kelim, on the subject of of articles or implements, right? And their being subject to purity or impurity, right? And this is a passage from early on in there. So can I get another volunteer to read for this one?
Rabbi, I have a quick question for you.
You bet.
Okay. Does anyone know how long Berurah lived while her father, the Rabbi Teradon, was alive? Because, I'm thinking that she was probably, obviously mentored a little bit by her father, and there was probably a level of respect given to her. Do you know, was she taught by her father, or she picked it up on her own, the knowledge, or how did that work?
Sure. Thanks, Craig. I'll just say that I'm not personally familiar with a teaching or text or tradition that clarifies where she started getting her rabbinic learning from, and like how that worked in terms of, whether she was doing all of this halachic learning when she was living with her father, or after she had gotten married to Rabbi Meir. It's an area for a lot of interesting speculation, but at least personally, based on my kind of looking around, I'm not familiar with any text that addresses it specifically.
I'm wondering if I'm thinking back that if he had taught his daughter, and if at that time it was considered something shocking, but then he dies in this horrific and heroic manner.
Mm.
I could see the other rabbi saying, out of respect for him, since he felt it was appropriate to teach his daughter, we will continue to honor his memory by also respecting his daughter. But I'm just, it's off the top of my head. I have
No, it's an entirely possible. I mean, and it makes a certain kind of sense. Sometimes in times of great social upheaval and, general crisis, space can be opened up for women to explore roles that maybe otherwise in more settled times they wouldn't be able to, right? It reminds me a little bit of the situation of like Rosie the Riveters, right? Back during, World War II, right? When women were not only allowed but encouraged to engage in industrial labor that women maybe hadn't been able to before, and that even after the war was over, women were discouraged from doing that again, right? That sometimes times of crisis and upheaval are times when social norms tend to kind of relax or break down a little bit. So I could very well see that being it. But all I can say is that I don't personally know of a text that speaks directly to the question.
And it's so interesting, we were watching Yentl the other day, and of course, Isaac Bashevis Singer had a lot of fun with the idea of a woman becoming a man so he could learn and everything, and what was involved with that,
Yeah.
obviously.
Yeah, you bet. In terms,
Rabbi,
yeah, Jeff?
I think I might have a partial answer. And I just looked it up in a book that I have. And it says that at one point she actually had a halachic debate with her father
Mhm.
in front of the sages, and it was ruled that she actually had a better opinion than him. And that's in Tosefta Kelim and Bava Kama 4:9.
That is true. Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple of passages in rabbinic literature that talk about her engaging in rabbinic debate with the rabbis. That's one of them, the one that you mentioned. This one is the other, the one from Tosefta Kelim. Yeah. So thanks for bringing that in, Joe. So this is the one from Tosefta Kelim, at least. I'm going to read it. So regarding a door bolt, right? This is like the kind of bar that you would use to kind of like keep a door shut in olden times, right? Rabbi Tarfon declares it impure, right, as in capable of receiving impurity, but the sages declare it pure, which means that it's not capable of receiving impurity. Meanwhile, Beruriah says one may remove it from this door and hang it on another door on Shabbat, right? When these words were spoken before Rabbi Yehoshua, he said, Beruriah has spoken well, i.e., she's the one who's got it actually correct. So, yeah, there's a couple of, like I said, there's a couple of instances like this recorded in rabbinic literature that make it clear that not only was Beruriah debating with the rabbis, that on at least one or two occasions, it was her halachic opinion which ended up winning out, right, in terms of the accepted halacha, right? Like I said, it's fairly unique. It's not something that that to my knowledge was that happened for any other woman in rabbinic Judaism. The only other comparable case I can even think of is the supposed, is the tradition that supposedly Rashi's daughters, the three daughters of Rashi, were taught Torah, and that they also had the practice or custom of personally of laying tefillin, right? Yeah, but as far as I know, there's no halachic opinions that they were advancing that are recorded in any tradition, right? So in that regard, Beruriah is kind of unique.
I found something else that I think makes her kind of unique and might have made her kind of cherished.
Mm-hmm.
This is from Rabbi Wikipedia, and noting that when Hananiah ben Teradion was tortured, his wife was also condemned to death, and he apparently had two daughters.
Yeah.
And one of them was condemned to rape and then to a brothel.
Yeah.
It was not Beruriah. So, and it says, and the one who was held in a brothel that Rabbi Meir succeeded in rescuing. So these daughters have been in horrific danger, and that might have been another reason for lenience and again, giving them a special place, a unique place of honor.
Yeah, absolutely. The story regarding Beruriah's sister, who was sent by the Romans to a brothel, is actually a really interesting one in that regard, in that it's recorded as an incident wherein Rabbi Meir made use of the name in order to rescue her. What this means is that, according to ancient Jewish belief, the name of God, that, like, by which I mean the sort of like holy, never pronounced Yud He Vav He, that name, right, has special power, right, and can even be used under certain circumstances to basically evoke miraculous or magical effects. And so, according to the story, in order to get his sister-in-law out of this terrible situation, Rabbi Meir taught the sacred name to the owner of the brothel, right, in exchange for him like releasing Beruriah's sister, right? And so basically, when the Roman authorities found out about this stuff and they were going to arrest this brothel owner, the brothel owner used basically invoked the name of God, may the God of Rabbi Meir save me, and was miraculously saved from the Roman persecution. So, in other words, the whole subject of rabbinic magic is itself a very interesting topic and one that's a little outside the scope of this class, but it's a very interesting situation in that the rabbis are generally very, they don't like it. They're very cautious about this sort of supposedly magical power, invoking the magical powers of evoking God's name. But in this particular case, Beruriah's sister's situation was considered so dire that Rabbi Meir evoked the name in order to make it possible to save his sister-in-law. There's a lot of just interesting story around Rabbi Meir and Beruriah and Elisha ben Abu. Like it's a very interesting like little assemblage of characters, and there's a lot of really interesting rabbinic stories that are told, about that generation of rabbis. All right, so when it comes to Beruriah's personality and strength of character, there's a number of interesting stories that are told about Beruriah. There's one in particular that I think that we can find in Midrash Mishlei, which is sort of the classic collection of rabbinic midrash on the book of Proverbs in Tanakh. So there's this story in Midrash Mishlei that really, to me, kind of evokes a sense of the kind of extremely strong-willed person that Beruriah was. So the story goes that one day on Shabbos, Rabbi Meir was off somewhere, lecturing in the study hall. And back at home, his two sons, whom he had with Beruriah, they died suddenly, just out of nowhere. So the story goes that when Rabbi Meir came home, right, toward the end of Shabbos, Beruriah had taken the bodies of the two boys and had like hidden them away in a separate room and covered them with a blanket because she didn't want to disturb Shabbat for her husband, because she knew if she revealed this to him, then he would kind of break down and he would not, be able to fulfill the obligation to feel joyful on Shabbat. And so he came home and he was asking where the sons were. And first she said, oh, they're over here. They went over this way. And he said, well, that's funny. I didn't see them coming home. And then she said, oh, well, they went over here and I'm sure they'll be back soon. And so she kept him ignorant of this up until the very end of Shabbat. And when he had finally recited Havdalah, she comes to him and she says to him, I have a halachic question for you. Rabbi, I have a halachic question for you. And he says, okay, well, what's the question? She says, a while ago, somebody gave me a pikadon. And in halachic terminology, this is an object that's given to somebody in trust to hold for them. A while ago, a person came and gave me a pikadon, and now he came for it. Should I return it to him or not? And Rabbi Meir says, well, who has a pikadon with him and doesn't need to return it to the owner? Of course you need to return it to this person. And Beruriah says to him, if it weren't for you expressing your view on this, then I would not have returned it. And that was when she led him into the room and she removed the sheet and showed him the 2 dead sons lying on the bed. And he began to cry. And he said, my sons, my sons. And she says to him, Rabbi, didn't you tell me that we need to return the pikadon to its owner? Adonai gave and Adonai took. And with those words, Rabbi Meir was comforted. Yeah, it's just a really powerful story about someone who's really able to engage with the tradition as a real genuine source of, of moral and emotional support under some pretty horrific and extreme circumstances. So anyway, that's a story that's told about Beruriah. The other classic story that's told about Beruriah and her interaction with Rabbi Meir, because that's another kind of story about her, is the kind where she interacts with Rabbi Meir, is another one that I want to share with you. This one's from Masechet Brachot 10a, and I'm going to share this, and if I can get a volunteer to read, that'd be super rad. That's this one. There were some hooligans. Who wants to be our reader now?
I can read if you want.
Okay, thanks, Eileen.
Okay. There were some hooligans in Rabbi Meir's neighborhood, and they used to trouble him greatly. Rabbi Meir would pray for mercy upon them so that they would die. His wife Beruriah said to him, what are you thinking? That when it says in scripture, Yatamu Chatayim, that means let sinners cease. Does it say Chotim sinners? No, it says Chatim sins. Moreover, go down to the end of the verse where it says, and the wicked will be no more. Are you thinking that because sinners cease, then the wicked will be no more, that they will die? Rather, pray for mercy upon them, that they should repent, and then they will be wicked no more. He prayed for mercy upon them, and they repented.
Thank you. Any thoughts on what's going on here in this little maaseh, this little story?
Yeah, but she corrects them. You don't really want them to die. You just want them to
and
get better.
I agree. And she kept cleverly points to the technical spelling of this or that or that, and that's why it's quoted, because it's very clever.
Yeah, this sort of midrashic mode of sort of interpreting very closely the grammar or the vocabulary of a scriptural passage is a very common mode of rabbinic moral arguments, and it's, I think, further indicative of the degree to which Beruriah could speak rabbinic to rabbis, right? This is, you could take Beruriah out of the story and replace her with somebody else with another rabbi entirely, and it would fit perfectly well. She knows how to communicate in the mode of rabbinic discourse very well, and she is very astute in that regard.
I'd also like to add that she could have chosen any set of scripture. She chose one that is based on justice and kindness, Whereas she could have chosen something that didn't have this change of, 2 letters
Mhm.
in the word. She could have just chosen something that would have supported him.
Yeah, absolutely. Whenever it comes to these kind of, midrashic turns, right? There's always a motivation by them, and you can really see the personality of the rabbi, through that. And this is something that we can see about Beruriah, is that she's the kind of person, right, for whom the idea of praying for the death of the sinner is morally unacceptable, right? Because she believes in the power of prayer, as all Jews of her time did, right? And so she says, no, don't pray for the death of the sinner, pray for the end of the sin. And characteristically, Rabbi Meir listens to her. He listens to her advice, he changes his practice, and in the end, his prayers are heard, and the hooligans do in fact repent and presumably cease to cause him trouble.
I think the other thing this, for our purposes, what this is showing is why she got into the fraternity in the first place. That she has mastered not just the textual stuff, but she's mastered the style.
Absolutely. And it shows, in that connection as well, that she is both Ba'alat halacha and Ba'alat agadah. She's both a mistress of halachic discourse, that of Jewish law, and she's a mistress of agadic discourse, i.e., the sort of moral and speculative areas of rabbinic speculation, of rabbinic discourse as well.
It seems to me it's almost a feminine approach to problem solving in some of these. I think when you hear some of these women who are working on initiatives for peace and so forth, the approach in this paragraph seems to strike me that it would be coming more from a woman than a man.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, Beth. I can kind of see where you're coming from there. What strikes you as particularly feminine about her girsa, about her approach in this regard?
Well, I think it's not looking at the hooligans necessarily as evil, as persons being evil, but what they're doing is a behavior you would like to change.
Yeah, interesting. Thanks.
Is there any other woman who is quoted at least somewhat like this?
No. As far as I can tell, it's pretty unique. And certainly no other named woman who is quoted in this manner, like with this kind of regularity in rabbinic literature. Generally, women who engaged with rabbis in some kind of discursive way in rabbinic literature are mostly treated as adversaries to be put down and not as equals to be listened to. So Beruriah is pretty unique in that regard. So I talked a little bit earlier about the sort of sad aspect of Beruriah's end, right? I think the end of Beruriah's life was not particularly happy. And also, significantly, it speaks volumes about the difficult situation of an intelligent woman who is granted that sort of provisional equal status in a generally misogynistic culture. So the story goes that at one point, Beruriah, in yet another debate with her husband, mocked the teaching of the sages that was held by many of the rabbis, that most women are lightheaded, right? She disagreed with that and was mocking that idea. And Rabbi Meir got his feelings hurt about that. And he told her that he would prove the truth of those words. So the story goes that he told one of his own students to try and seduce her. And at first, it didn't work. In fact, it didn't work for a very long time. But after many, 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 many attempts, eventually Beruriah succumbed. and was seduced by this student. Then later on, when she found out that Rabbi Meir was the one who had sent this man to seduce her, she was so overcome with horror at the whole thing that she ended up strangling herself, that she killed herself over that. And that was the end of her life. This is clearly, to say the absolute least of it, right? A terribly bad call on Rabbi Meir's part, right? And at least according to some traditions, he was so affected by this and like the horror over what he had, basically caused to pass regarding his wife, that he ended up, fleeing Eretz Yisrael altogether and going to teach, elsewhere out in the diaspora for some significant amount of time, and didn't return back for a very long time. It clearly affected him a lot. I mean, obviously, it affected Beruriah quite a bit more. So this is how she ends her life, and perhaps ironically, or perhaps very, naturally in some respects, the end of this incident, which causes her to take her own life, is very much bound up in one of the very few moments where she actually speaks in an explicit way in favor of her own sex, in favor of other women, right? And trying to defend other women within that male-dominated rabbinic space. And so that's kind of the end of her life. I'm going to open it up here for...
Rabbi, is it possible that narrative was conveyed after her life as a preventative story so that others would not follow in her footsteps, or it's, that's what it sounds like to me. It sounds to me like, don't follow this path because this is what's going to happen.
I mean, it's entirely possible. I mean, I'll reiterate something which I feel is always good to mention every couple of lessons here with this class, which is all of these things that we know about the various rabbis and the various people who lived in their orbit, right? All of these stories are stories that are told by the rabbis in rabbinic literature, right? And none of them have the status of history as we would think of it today, right? These are all tales. The term in Hebrew is ma'asim, right? They're all stories, right? And the stories are always engaging and interesting and tell us something really interesting about the ways that the rabbis thought and looked at the world. But, they are stories, right? And the stories oftentimes are passed along from one person to another, and they change over time. There's different versions of the stories sometimes. You've got to take it all with a grain of salt. But, with Beruriah, as with so many other figures from rabbinic history, we don't really have any sort of outside objective proof of their existence or what their lives were really like, right? We've just got the stories, right? But yes, it's absolutely possible that these stories are told not just to record something factual about this person's life, but oftentimes, I think, to try and present some sort of moral point or try to, make some kind of fulfill some kind of rhetorical purpose. So the idea of that story being kind of a warning against the dangers of teaching your daughter Torah may, it's not inconceivable that was the case, and that's where some of these stories came from. Sharon, I think I see a hand up there.
Yeah, that's me. I was thinking just exactly along the same lines as Craig, that these are people revising her life because we don't want women to get uppity. What I'm also thinking about, in Victorian times, there were Bibles for women that left out parts you didn't want women to know because they were the naughty parts, and women were too delicate to know these things. So they left out all the sex scenes from the Bible, so in women's Bibles, because you had to protect them because they were so fragile.
Sure, absolutely. The phenomenon of specifically women's Bibles was very much a thing in the 19th century in the Jewish world as well. There's an entire genre of literature. The term that used to be used for these kind of texts was Seina Ureina, come and see, in a feminine in a feminine mode. And these were like sort of abridgments of scripture translated from Hebrew into Yiddish and sort of presented in a sort of, not in a direct translation, but in a sort of like, kind of general sort of, summing up kind of style. And it was intended specifically for women because Jewish women at that time were not taught in Hebrew. They were only taught to read in Yiddish. And so, yeah, that was a real literary genre for Jewish women as well back in the 19th century.
It still exists. My friend is evangelical, and she has a woman's Bible.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
It just seems to me that the point of the story is that no matter how hard you try, and no matter how much you try and blur the distinction between the sexes, it won't work.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and certainly, it won't work if it's not allowed to work, right? I think it's the really significant thing lesson about the story from my perspective, at least, is that it says something really pointed about what it means to be, a minority within a community, which is that no matter how hard you work to not fit whatever the stereotype is around, you or your people, your kind, right? There's a lot of institutional power on the part of the majority, right, to kind of force you to fit that mold, whether you want to or not, right? In the story, I mean, even in the story that has come down to us, right? Beruriah rejects this would-be seducer multiple times, right? She only gives in the end, apparently out of, this sheer persistence of this guy, right? It doesn't really strike one as a fair contest in that regard, right? It's very much there's an imbalance of power there that is basically making it impossible for her to succeed. And I think that says something very powerful about the situation of being sort of, a designated exception, right? In that way.
Yeah, and I'm sure she was protecting her husband's student by not saying anything to her husband.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I don't know. Did I miss something in the story? Why would her husband do this? Why was he argued with her and he was angry? Is that what you said?
So, yeah, she and him were having a debate about this rabbinic teaching that women are lightheaded. And she was insisting that women are not lightheaded and laughed at the idea. And he was insisting that they were. And I mean, I think at least my reading of the story is that fairly clearly what's going on here is that Rabbi Meir was so wrapped up, so invested in being right, that he went to this extreme degree in order to prove himself right? Which is not an unusual or unknown kind of phenomenon, that sometimes people can get so worked up that they end up going to ridiculous and sometimes horrifying extremes to prove themselves right without really paying attention to the question about, like, is it really going to make anyone, happy or do any good for anybody, right?
The undercurrent is he feels threatened by his wife's intelligence.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's definitely an element of that going on. Yeah. And that's fairly close to the surface of the story, even as it's come down to us transmitted by the rabbis. So
the thing I think is very curious is that this activity, this pattern of behavior, testing the wife for her morality, is the subject of so many plays, so many operas, so many novels. And it's not just the Western canon. This was in the Greek canon. This was everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's particularly noteworthy here just for how uncharacteristic it is in terms of being like completely counter to rabbinic values themselves, right? From a rabbinic perspective, Rabbi Meir's behavior here is absurdly counter to Jewish values. Even within the sort of patriarchal system of rabbinic Judaism, rabbis are supposed to be actively, like a good Jew from the rabbi's perspective is supposed to be actively working to preserve women's, chastity and like exposure to men who are not their husbands, right? Rabbi Meir is going completely against that in order to make a point, right? Which is, okay, kind of bizarre behavior, but it's maybe not, we can kind of maybe see that there's like, it's not, we can imagine psychologically, at least, if not values wise, we can imagine psychologically, that, this is something that Rabbi Meir may have done.
Well, as long as you stay in your lane,
Mm-hmm.
you will be valued, and don't challenge the status quo.
Yeah, well, and I think that that's really it, right? Is the real situation here, the real issue here on some level is that Beruriah was maybe trying to push outside of like her being the only one and sort of make a claim for maybe reevaluating women's subaltern status within the Jewish community. And I think the point where she starts, questioning the status quo for the sake of other women, that's maybe where it started to become threatening on some level.
But Rabbi, did she specifically make that point about equal rights, or was just her presence and her stature the challenge? Did she ever specifically say, that I shouldn't be the exception, or are we reading into it?
Well, no, I think that we're dealing with an ambiguous kind of situation here, right? Which is not that unusual. So on the one hand, there's at least one story that talks about, one story that's told about Beruriah is that in her youth, right, a rabbi came up to her to ask her for directions, and he used a few more words than you would necessarily strictly need to in order to ask for directions. And she chastised him and says, isn't it the case that you're supposed to limit the amount that you're speaking to a woman, right? You should have said it this way, right? In a shorter way, right? So in that respect, in that story, she's upholding these notions of like needing to limit women's exposure to men, right? But on the other hand, here in this story, the precipitating incident is that she's laughing at and protesting against this rabbinic teaching that all women are lightheaded, right? So in that moment, she very much is, at least subtly, pushing back against the status quo by saying, well, okay, women aren't lightheaded, or at least not any more lightheaded than men. And that's what brings the hammer down. Mickey.
Yeah, I'm thinking about Rabbi Meir as a personality also, because of his relationship with Elisha ben Abuya, how he wanted so much for Abuya to rejoin, to believe in God. He just pulled him along. He was the most devoted student, and he doesn't cut his wife a break in the same way he did with him. And it just speaks to that, the misogyny.
Absolutely. Well, and I think that like what's interesting, this is just sort of a factor of a sort of a situation that has cropped up in rabbinic literature, is that I think interestingly, we have like of all one of the figures in rabbinic literature, we have this incredibly complex psychological picture of Rabbi Meir in particular, because of the extensive literature about his relationship with these two larger than life and really interesting figures, right? Beruriah is an interesting figure in her own right. Elisha ben Abuya is an interesting figure in his own right. And then you've got Rabbi Meir here, who's an interesting figure in his own right, and he's got relationships with both of them. So we've got so much interesting psychological stuff about Rabbi Meir, which results in, a very complex psychological profile of a man who's got a lot of contradictions, There are times in some stories he listens to his wife, like the story about where she was talking with him about the hooligans, right? And then there's this story, right? which, I mean, I won't say in his defense, but like, maybe speaking to, how utterly screwed up this whole situation was, even from his perspective, right? The idea that he was so horrified by this that he basically had to leave the country to deal with his grief and probably self-recrimination is maybe indicative that, like, once he woke up from the insanity of his behavior, like, he saw what a turd he had been. Not that that did Beruriah any good.
Joe?
So, Rabbi, getting back to the story of meeting the rabbi on the road. Yeah, she, like you said, she chastises him, but she's also showing that she knows the halacha better than he does.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's a real sassy move, like, all around there.
I think she's showing how ridiculous that halacha was.
Yeah, I think that reading does make sense as well. Yeah. And certainly is in keeping with the fact that she was, like, in this other story, laughing at the whole women as lightheaded thing. Yeah. I mean, flipping it on the other side, right? If we actually look at it from a different perspective, right? Like, what actually goes down with her in the story where Rabbi Meir sends his student to seduce her may be evidence of, like, a different perspective on these practices, which is maybe Beruriah sees it as a valuable thing to limit male exposure to women, not to protect men's chastity, but to defend women from the men, right? Maybe Beruriah sees it from that perspective, and maybe from that perspective, given what actually happens to her in the end, maybe it's not an unjustified perspective, right? Maybe from her perspective, it makes perfectly justifiable sense to say, well, maybe it's better to keep men, somewhat at some distance from women, because they can screw up women's lives if they get on a wild hair to do so. I don't know.
In a piece of New Jersey trivia, and I don't know if it's still in existence, but in Elizabeth, New Jersey, there was a yeshiva for girls called the Beruriah High School for Girls. So.
Cool. Nice. It's a good name for a girls' high school.
Eliana went there for a little while, Judy's daughter.
So was Beruriah the only female scholar of her time?
Yes.
Jewish scholar?
I mean, not just of her time. Like, to the best of my knowledge, like, the list of women in pre-modern times who studied who studied Jewish scholarship is incredibly, incredibly small. We see in the Bible, right, in the Tanakh, there are quite a few, not a million, but like a few women who serve as, like, prophets and, wise women, and who are, doing stuff, right, like that, right? There's Huldah, and there's Miriam, and there's Devorah, right? We've got a few women in the Bible who are, like, I hesitate to use this kind of stereotyped phrase, but powerful women, right? Once we get to the rabbinic age, though, really, we've got Beruriah, we've got Rashi's daughters, and we've got basically no one up until the modern era. I mean, it's a really narrow field. Once again, not because there weren't wise and intelligent Jewish women out there, but because, women weren't allowed to get the education that, right? Beruriah is allowed to get the education that she needs to do this, and she, like, takes off and flies into the stratosphere. But, unless you can get the education, right, then what are you going to do? You can't play.
I'm reminded of one of the lines from, I guess it was Unorthodox, and I didn't really realize that this was a thing, but apparently it's a thing. When her husband says to her, you can read in Torah? Women aren't allowed to study Torah. And that was just taken of, like, of course they're not, sort of thing. And it's like, oh, I didn't know that. I'm not well versed in the Orthodoxy, but that was just the norm.
Absolutely. It was not like with a very few exceptions, that was by and large the norm in the Jewish community up until, like, fairly recently. And I'm talking, like, late 1800s, where that started to change in liberal Jewish circles, right? In the realm of, like, reform, or, like, those kind of circles, right? And only fairly recently has it started to be acceptable in Orthodox circles at all for women to study Torah. And even now, it's very much a controversial thing in many Orthodox communities. Sharon.
The only thing that I remember doing reading on that was some way approaching this was in medieval and pre-modern Egypt, where, and you get this from the Geniza documents, so we're talking about the year in modern era, so it's like 1200, 1300, 1400, that women could teach aleph base. They could teach boys in like kindergarten through sixth grade or seventh grade to give them their starter in Hebrew. They knew enough Hebrew to teach there. And in poor communities, there would be a limit to the number of people who are educated, so this was valued. And the other thing would be that in the synagogue, the rabbi's wife would stand in the front of the balcony and explain to the women what was being taught downstairs during services.
Yeah, basically.
That's again a minority and in difficult situations.
Robert, when you mentioned the 1800s, so I remember years ago reading a book called The Maiden of Ludomir by Gershon Winkler, and it was about a woman who actually fulfilled the role of the Rebbe in Ludomir. Her name was Hannah Rochel, and people would go to consult with her as they would go to consult with a regular male Rebbe, but she would sit in a room behind a curtain, right? And the men would come and sit on, sort of like there was like a mechitza.
Yeah, to avoid being in the same room together.
And the men would talk to her, and she acted as a full Rebbe. In that time, like I said, I remember reading the book years ago, but it fits right in with what you're saying about the 19th century.
That sounds like an interesting book, Joe. I had not heard of that one. I'll have to look it up someday.
Yeah, The Maiden of Ludomir by Gershon Winkler.
Cool, I'll check it out. Thank you.
That philosophy is not dead yet. Our neighbors have a bumper sticker on their car that says, "My husband knows halacha."
I've seen that one like in the wild myself. I've also seen similar ones where it's like my husband studies Daf Yomi, and I'm always like, makes me think, well, what about you, lady? But obviously it's a different community.
Yeah, and I this neighbor across the street that has that, I'm thinking, well, think about if you're an Orthodox woman, and she certainly is, how much halacha she has to know just to run the life of the family.
Right. Well, and that's the thing too, is that, right, like always and at all times, right, whether women were receiving formal instruction or not, there's quite a huge amount of stuff that women needed to practically actually know, right? But that's not the same thing as having like the status of having like studied, right, or having gone to, to a formal institution. Stacy, do you have a hand up? Oh, okay, sorry. I think we're kind of getting to the end of our time here. Anyone else have anything lingering that they'd like to share before we wrap it up for tonight? All right, cool. Well, let's call it there, folks. I'm not 100% certain who we're going to do next week. I haven't really decided yet. So I guess stay tuned. It'll have to be a surprise. It's been fun doing this like trio of interesting folks about Rabbi Meir and Elisha Ben Abuya and Beruriah. They're all really interesting, sometimes flawed characters. But yeah, next week we'll get into to somebody else. I don't know, maybe Shimon Bar Yochai. I feel like we're about due to take a look at him. Yeah, maybe we'll do him. I don't know. We'll see. But until then, it's been great seeing you all here tonight, and thank you so much for joining us for this class. And I will do my best to get this uploaded to YouTube as soon as I can reasonably manage to do so. Thanks everyone for being with us tonight.
You, Rabbi.
Hey,
Thank you.
Rabbi. Thank you.
Thank you.
Night.